Calvin had always enjoyed his Aunt Myra's visits. She would arrive with gifts, a warm smile, and stories that made him forget his loneliness. But today was different. As she stepped into the house, Calvin noticed something in her eyes, something cold, something unfamiliar. She still smiled, but there was a weight to her presence, a tension that hung in the air. Calvin couldn't put his finger on it, but it was there, like an unspoken truth that was slowly unfolding. He had always trusted her, but today, that trust felt like a dangerous thing. Little did he know this visit would mark the beginning of a nightmare that would change his life forever. What seemed like a harmless encounter was the first step into a world of fear, one that would push Calvin into a battle he wasn't prepared for, a battle against someone he thought he knew. The horrors that lay ahead were beyond his imagination, and yet they were already unfolding right before him, hidden behind the mask of the person he had once adored. Calvin was an ordinary boy caught in the whirlwind of his teenage years. He was intelligent, curious, and full of life, but there was a lingering emptiness in his heart. His parents, though loving, were rarely present. His mother, Lucia, worked long shifts at the Central Clinic in Lakewood, often returning home late into the night. His father, Aaron, was deeply immersed in the world of finance, often staying at the office far beyond office hours. The house, once filled with the warmth of family, had become silent and cold. Calvin had grown accustomed to the solitude, spending most of his time alone. The walls of their large house, which should have offered comfort, instead felt like an impenetrable barrier that separated him from the world outside. At school, Calvin was surrounded by friends, his laughter filling the air, but it was different when he returned home. He couldn't escape the feeling of being alone, of being disconnected from those who should have been closest to him. He often wondered why his parents had to work so much, why they couldn't be there for him the way he saw other kids' parents were. It wasn't that they didn't love him. He knew they did. It was just that their busy lives made it difficult for them to truly see him. Then one evening, after another long day at school, Lucia suggested something new. She suggested that Calvin spend some time with his Aunt Myra, who had been wanting to visit. This offer came as a surprise, but it was one Calvin welcomed with open arms. He had always adored his aunt. Myra was different from his parents. She was full of life, always energetic and creative. She would bring him new toys, games, and books filled with puzzles, riddles, and stories. Her presence had always been a welcome distraction from his loneliness. Calvin remembered the way she would smile and laugh, filling the room with joy. She had an infectious personality that always seemed to chase away the dullness of his days. Aunt Myra had always been a colorful presence in his life. She was Lucia's older sister, but their relationship had always been unique. While Lucia had married young and had a family, Myra had remained single, choosing instead to pursue a career as an artist. She lived in a small, cozy apartment on the outskirts of Lakewood, a world apart from the structured, busy life his mother led. Myra's life was filled with creativity and color, a stark contrast to the grayness of Calvin's usual routine. He had always looked forward to her visits. Every time she came over, it felt like a breath of fresh air. She never failed to bring something special, sometimes a new set of art supplies, other times a puzzle book, or even a new game to play together. Myra was always supportive of Calvin's interests, praising his drawings and encouraging him to follow his creative dreams. She would tell him how talented he was, how he would grow up to be a great artist one day. Her words had always filled him with warmth and confidence. For a time, her visits were the highlight of his days. But there was more to it than just the gifts and encouragement. Myra brought a kind of energy with her that Calvin had never experienced with anyone else. She seemed to understand him in a way his parents never did. And for a long time, that was enough. As the weeks passed, Calvin began to notice small changes in the way Myra interacted with him. At first, it was hardly noticeable. Just little things. A longer hug, an extra look of affection. Calvin, still used to her lively and carefree attitude, thought nothing of it. However, the more time he spent with her, the more his feelings began to shift. Myra's presence, once a source of excitement, was now starting to feel different, though he couldn't quite pinpoint why. His mother, noticing how much time they were spending together, encouraged it. She was happy that Calvin was spending time with someone who seemed to bring him so much joy, and for a while it felt normal, almost too normal. But something inside Calvin couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing, something he couldn't understand. and certainly didn't know how to voice. Myra's visits, once the brightest part of his week, started to bring with them a sense of unease. Calvin couldn't explain it, but the happiness he once felt during her visits was starting to feel like a shadow of itself. With each new visit, he began to notice the slight changes in her behavior, her persistent attention, the way she looked at him, the way she would make a comment or a suggestion that felt a little too much. He tried to push these thoughts aside, convincing himself it was all in his head. But deep down, Calvin couldn't ignore the sense of discomfort growing within him. But with each visit from Myra, Calvin began to notice more peculiarities in her behavior. What had once felt like love and care now seemed to carry an unsettling edge. His mind couldn't fully comprehend it yet, but he knew something had shifted. Something was wrong. This growing sense of unease would only escalate, leading him into a darkness he wasn't prepared for. The innocent visits of the past now felt like a prelude to something much more sinister, and Calvin had no idea just how far it would go. Over the following weeks, Aunt Myra began to spend more time with Calvin. Her visits, once sporadic and filled with fun, turned into near-daily events. At first, Calvin welcomed the extra attention. She would bring new puzzles, games, and art supplies, and they would spend hours playing together. Myra's infectious laughter, her playful energy, filled the silence of the house, and for a while Calvin thought things were returning to normal. But as the days passed, he started to notice subtle shifts in her behavior, ones that he couldn't quite understand. The games they played became more unusual. At first, they were innocent enough, simple card games, drawing contests, and riddles. But gradually, Myra began to introduce strange, sometimes uncomfortable activities. These games were unlike anything Calvin had ever encountered. She would ask him to perform odd tasks, like standing in certain positions for long periods of time, or drawing pictures that felt unnecessary and bizarre. Her requests, though still seemingly playful, began to feel invasive, and Calvin found himself growing uneasy. There was something about her insistence that didn't sit right with him. He couldn't articulate why, but the fun was starting to fade, replaced by an underlying sense of dread. At first, Calvin tried to ignore his discomfort. He wanted to believe it was just his imagination running wild, that he was overreacting. But as Myra's behavior became increasingly erratic, it was harder to dismiss the feeling that something was wrong. She would smile, but it wasn't the warm, comforting smile he had always known. It was colder, sharper, almost as if it was forced. Her laughter no longer filled the room with joy. Instead, it echoed in a way that felt hollow, unsettling. And her gaze, there was something about the way she looked at him that made his skin crawl. It was as though she were seeing something else in him, something she didn't fully understand, but wanted to control. Calvin couldn't escape the feeling that her intentions had shifted. What had once been affection now felt like manipulation. Myra became more persistent, always suggesting new activities, new games, each one more strange than the last. At times, she would gently coax him into doing things that made him uncomfortable, her tone soothing, almost hypnotic. But Calvin wasn't stupid. He could tell that she was pushing his boundaries, testing how far he would go before saying no. He hesitated more and more, his stomach twisting with unease. What had started as innocent fun now felt like a trap, and the more he tried to back away, the more Myra seemed to pursue him, eager to pull him back into her web. One evening, after a long day of strange games, Calvin found himself sitting in the living room, trying to focus on something else to distract himself. Myra had left for the night, but her presence lingered in the house, like a shadow hanging over him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, even though he was alone. He lay awake that night, his thoughts racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. There was no clear reason for his anxiety, no overt act or obvious threat, but something in the air felt suffocating, like an impending storm that he couldn't quite see. He couldn't sleep, the unease gnawing at him until the early hours of the morning. The next day, Myra returned, just like she always did. She greeted him with her usual enthusiasm, but there was a new edge to her smile, something that made him instinctively pull back. She suggested they play a new game, one that she claimed would be even more fun than the last. Calvin hesitated. He had grown tired of the constant pressure to participate in these strange games, but he didn't know how to refuse. As much as he wanted to say no, something about her presence made him feel trapped, like there was no escape. And so he reluctantly agreed. She led him to a different room, one he had never played in before. The walls felt colder, the air heavier. Myra closed the door behind them, her smile widening. It was then that Calvin realized this wasn't just another game. This was something different, something that made his heart race with fear. The room was too small, the air too thick, and Myra's expression too intense. She started to give him instructions, asking him to do things that felt increasingly uncomfortable. It wasn't fun anymore. It wasn't even a game. It was a test, one that Calvin wasn't sure he wanted to pass. His mind screamed for him to stop, to leave, but his body wouldn't respond. Myra's soft voice, though soothing, carried an edge of something darker, something more sinister. Calvin's instincts were screaming at him now, but it was too late to turn back. As she coaxed him deeper into this new game, he felt a cold chill settle over him. He realized with growing horror that Myra wasn't the person he thought she was. What had seemed like harmless fun was now a terrifying game of control, and he was caught in the web she had spun. Horror bubbled up inside him as he realized the truth. This wasn't just a game anymore. This was something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. The air felt thick with tension as Calvin followed Myra into the dimly lit room, his heart pounding in his chest. The game she had suggested was unlike any other they had played before. She had told him it would be exciting, different, but to him it already felt wrong. There was an intensity in her voice, a strange urgency that had crept into her every word. She instructed him to do things that made his skin crawl, simple actions at first, like walking around the room in a specific pattern, then more complex tasks. She asked him to hold certain poses, his body strained, his muscles aching as he tried to comply. It felt like she was testing him, pushing him to his limits in ways he couldn't understand. Calvin's mind was racing. His gut told him that something wasn't right, that these games had crossed a line. He had played along before, but this was different. Each task felt more invasive, more uncomfortable. Myra's presence was overwhelming, like an invisible pressure pushing down on him, making it hard to breathe. He tried to convince himself that it was all just part of the game, but the dread that had been building inside him couldn't be ignored any longer. His stomach churned with unease and a sense of panic slowly crept up on him. When Myra asked him to do something even more disturbing, something he wasn't willing to do, his fear reached its peak. It wasn't just uncomfortable anymore. It was terrifying. The way Myra's eyes glinted with anticipation, the way she moved around him, guiding him through every motion, it all felt wrong. He wanted to stop, to shout at her to leave him alone, but his voice failed him. The control she had over him was undeniable, and it felt like there was no escape from the situation she had created. In that moment, Calvin finally gathered the strength to speak up. He told Myra, in the smallest voice he could muster, that he didn't want to continue. His heart raced as he waited for her response, half expecting her to understand, to let him go. But instead of relief, a chill ran down his spine as Myra's smile widened, her eyes darkening. She didn't acknowledge his discomfort. She didn't stop the game. Instead, she moved closer to him, her tone becoming more insistent, more persuasive. It was as though she couldn't comprehend why he was reluctant to participate. Calvin's pulse quickened as he realized that his refusal had only made things worse. Myra's response was not what he expected. It was as if his protest had sparked something deeper within her, a twisted desire to continue regardless of how he felt. Her touch, once gentle, had become almost suffocating, and every word she spoke now carried a sense of force that made him feel trapped. He could no longer ignore the fear that gripped him. His instincts screamed at him to run, to escape, but he was paralyzed. In the back of his mind, Calvin knew he had to get out, but the overwhelming force of the situation made it hard to think clearly. He had never been so terrified in his life. The game was no longer a game. It had become a terrifying reality that he couldn't control. As Myra continued to guide him through the increasingly strange and dangerous tasks, Calvin realized with horror that she wasn't going to stop. No matter how much he wanted to quit, no matter how loudly his mind screamed for him to break free, she would keep pushing him, keep dragging him deeper into the nightmare she had created. It was only when he could no longer stand the weight of her presence, the overwhelming fear that had taken over his entire being, that Calvin managed to break free. His legs shook with exhaustion and terror as he stumbled away from her, his mind reeling from the invasion of his body and thoughts. He could hardly breathe, the air too thick, the room too small. For the first time, Calvin felt completely helpless, trapped in a situation he couldn't control. Horrified and shaken, he knew he couldn't stay silent anymore. He had to tell someone, anyone, about what was happening. But as the fear continued to gnaw at him, Calvin realized he had no idea how to make anyone believe him. Myra had always been so kind, so loving. No one would understand, but he had to try. He had to tell his parents, and he had to make them believe him before it was too late. The decision to speak up weighed heavily on Calvin. He had spent countless nights turning the events over in his mind, each time hoping it was just a nightmare or a misunderstanding. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. Something had happened, something he couldn't fully explain but felt in his bones. His terror grew stronger with each passing day, gnawing at him until he couldn't ignore it any longer. He needed to tell someone, to make sense of the horror that had consumed him. After days of sleepless nights, Calvin decided to confide in his teacher, Miss Rianda. She was someone he trusted, someone who had always listened when he spoke. He hoped that, by telling her, he could finally rid himself of the suffocating fear that had taken over his life. That afternoon after school, Calvin found the courage to approach her. His heart raced as he walked toward her desk, his hands trembling. The words caught in his throat, but he forced himself to speak. He told her everything, everything about Myra's visits, the strange games, the way she had made him feel uncomfortable and trapped. As the words spilled out, he could see Miss Rianda's face softening with concern. She didn't interrupt him, just listened carefully, nodding as he explained the situation. For a brief moment, Calvin allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of the end of the nightmare? But when he finished, her reaction took him completely by surprise. She paused, her expression unreadable, and then spoke in a calm, measured voice. Calvin, I understand how you feel, but I need to tell you something important. Your Aunt Myra was recently cleared of any wrongdoing in a court case. The investigation showed that there was no evidence of any wrongdoing on her part. She was completely exonerated. Calvin's blood ran cold. The words didn't make sense. How could this be? How could Myra be innocent when everything he had experienced with her was the opposite of innocent? His mind spun with confusion, and for a moment, doubt crept in. Maybe he had misunderstood the situation. Maybe it was all in his head. The idea that he could have imagined it all, that his fear had distorted the reality, sent a wave of uncertainty crashing over him. Calvin stood frozen, staring at Miss Rianda, his heart racing with a mix of disbelief and fear. She didn't seem to be lying, and yet her words contradicted everything he had felt. Was it possible that his memory had betrayed him? Could he have been wrong? He wanted to believe her, wanted to think that this was all just a misunderstanding, but his instincts told him otherwise. The unease that had settled in him months ago never fully went away. His gut screamed at him that something was wrong, that the version of events Miss Rianda described wasn't the whole truth. He wanted to push her explanation aside, but the nagging doubts were impossible to ignore. Leaving the school that day, Calvin couldn't shake the feeling of confusion and dread that weighed him down. The more he tried to convince himself that Miss Rianda was right, the more unsettled he became. What if Myra really had been exonerated? What if he had misinterpreted everything? The idea gnawed at him, but the fear that had been bubbling inside him for so long didn't just disappear. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was still terribly wrong, no matter what anyone said. It was as if his instincts were screaming louder than the logic of the situation. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the silence in the house felt even more oppressive than usual. He couldn't sleep, his mind racing with doubt. But then, just as he was beginning to drift off, he heard a soft sound, a creak from the hallway. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't unusual for the house to settle at night, but this sound was different. It was deliberate. Calvin held his breath, straining to listen, but the sound faded into the quiet. He tried to brush it off, telling himself it was nothing. But deep down he knew. He knew that something was about to happen, something he couldn't stop. And just like that, in the dark of the night, he understood. Myra was coming back. She was going to appear again, and this time the danger would be even greater. Soon enough, Myra returned. But this time, her presence was even more suffocating. her behavior even more bizarre and threatening. The games were over. Now it was something far more sinister. It was late in the evening when Calvin first noticed the strange feeling creeping over him. The air in the house felt thick, almost suffocating, and his instincts screamed that something was wrong. He had spent months living with the fear that Myra was somehow still lurking in the shadows, and now that fear had returned. He had tried to convince himself that everything was fine after her disappearance, that the nightmare was over, but deep down he knew it wasn't over. He hadn't felt safe since the first day she had walked into his life. That night, as Calvin sat in the living room, the silence in the house felt even more oppressive than usual. His parents were out, and the house once again seemed empty. He glanced at the front door, half expecting it to open, half expecting Myra to step through it as she had so many times before. But this time, he wasn't sure if he would survive the encounter. The doorbell rang, and a chill ran down his spine. His heart raced as he stood up, cautiously walking to the door. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. When he opened it, his breath caught in his throat. There she stood, Myra. But something was different about her now. Her eyes were cold, and the smile that had once made him feel safe now seemed like a mask, a facade hiding something dark and terrifying. She told him everything was over now, that she had been released, that everything had been a misunderstanding. But Calvin could see right through her lies. There was no warmth in her voice, no affection in her gestures. It was all calculated, manipulative. She stepped forward, her eyes locking onto his, and for a moment, Calvin couldn't move. He felt trapped, as though her presence had paralyzed him, as though the past few months had been building up to this very moment. She spoke soothingly, almost sweetly, her words wrapping around him like a net. Calvin's body froze as she led him inside, guiding him through the house as if everything was normal, as if nothing had happened. But he could feel the darkness beneath her calm exterior. He could feel the trap closing around him. When they reached the living room, Calvin knew it was too late to turn back. The door slammed shut behind them, and the sense of dread intensified. The room felt smaller, darker, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Calvin's breath quickened. Myra's smile never wavered, but there was nothing playful in her gaze now. It was cold, calculating. She began to move closer, and everything inside Calvin screamed for him to run, but his feet felt rooted to the floor, his body unwilling to obey. Myra was drawing closer, and as she reached out to touch him, Calvin's instincts finally took over. He stepped back, his heart pounding, and a surge of adrenaline coursed through his veins. For the first time in months, he realized he wasn't helpless anymore. He had been trapped in fear for too long, but now it was his turn to fight back. He reached for the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and swung it with everything he had. Myra stumbled back, caught off guard, her eyes widening in surprise. She had underestimated him. For a brief moment, Calvin thought he had a chance, that he could finally end this nightmare. But Myra wasn't finished. She recovered quickly, her anger rising, her eyes flashing with fury. She lunged at him, her movement swift and violent. Calvin's heart raced as he dodged, his pulse thumping in his ears. He didn't know how long he could keep this up, but he wasn't going to give in. Not now, not ever again. In a desperate move, Calvin grabbed a nearby chair and used it to block her, pushing her away with all his strength. He didn't care about the consequences anymore. His life was on the line, and there was no turning back. Myra was relentless, but so was he. He had nothing left to lose. With one final burst of strength, Calvin managed to knock her to the ground, his hands trembling as he stood over her. For a moment, everything was still. Myra lay on the floor, her chest heaving, her expression a mix of shock and anger. Calvin stood there, panting, sweat trickling down his forehead. His mind was spinning, his body exhausted, but he knew one thing for sure. He had won. He had fought back, and for the first time in a long while, he felt in control of his life. But as Myra lay there, it became clear that the battle wasn't truly over. She wouldn't disappear so easily. And Calvin knew that somehow she would find a way to come back. The days following Myra's arrest were a blur for Calvin. He had spent so much time living in fear, constantly looking over his shoulder, always wondering when she would return. But now she was gone. The police had taken her away, and the nightmare seemed to be over. Calvin tried to convince himself that he was safe, that everything would return to normal, but deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. The house, which had once felt suffocating with her presence, now felt too quiet. His parents, still shocked by the events that had unfolded, tried their best to comfort him, to reassure him that everything would be okay. They were there for him, more present than they had ever been before, trying to make up for the time they had spent away. Calvin appreciated their efforts, but the fear he had carried for so long didn't just disappear. The emotional scars were deep, and despite the comforting presence of his family, he couldn't shake the feeling that something would always be missing. Myra's presence had left an indelible mark on him, one that would never fade. In the days that followed, Calvin began to open up more to his parents. He shared his fears, his confusion, and his anger. They listened, offering support and understanding, but there was still a part of him that remained distant, a part that couldn't fully trust anyone, not even them. The psychological weight of what had happened was something he couldn't explain, something that clung to him like a shadow, following him wherever he went. He knew that his mind would never fully be at peace until he could rid himself of that lingering fear. But he also realized that it wasn't about forgetting, it was about learning to live with it, learning to trust himself again. As the weeks passed, Calvin began to rebuild his life. He went back to school, to his routines, but everything felt different. The people around him seemed unaware of the silent battle he was fighting within himself. His friends, though kind, didn't understand the deep, persistent anxiety he carried. He found it hard to relate to them, to explain the terror that had gripped him for so long. It was as though they existed in a world untouched by the darkness he had experienced. But despite his struggles, Calvin was determined not to let his past define him. He began to trust his instincts more, to listen to that quiet voice inside that had warned him about Myra when no one else could see the danger. He learned the importance of speaking up when something felt wrong, of not letting fear silence his voice. It wasn't an easy lesson, and there were moments when the doubt crept in, when the fear threatened to overwhelm him once again. But each time he fought it back, reminding himself that he had survived, that he was stronger than he had been before. Even though Myra was gone, her shadow never truly left Calvin. Every creak of the floorboards, every unexpected noise in the house, every glance over his shoulder, he was reminded of the terror he had lived through. It was as if she had imprinted herself on his life, and no matter how hard he tried, in the quiet moments when he was all alone with his thoughts, Calvin couldn't help but wonder if this was truly the end. Myra was behind bars, but something about the way she had controlled him, the way she had invaded his life, left him wondering if she would ever truly be gone. The fear that she would find a way to return, to haunt him once more, was a constant undercurrent in his life. But for now, Calvin had made his peace. He had faced his demons and fought back. And while he couldn't erase the past, he knew that he had the power to move forward. Myra might have been locked away, but the shadow of her presence, the lingering uncertainty, would always remain with him. A reminder that sometimes the battle for peace is never truly over.